Hello and welcome to the second tutorial where we will go through database setup. So in the previous tutorial, we managed to set up a Spring Boot application with all the dependencies and we managed to open it in IntelliJ. The one missing configuration part is basically the database. And as we've discussed last time, we are going to use Postgres SQL just due to its popularity, powerfulness, and robustness. There are actually multiple different ways to install and start a Postgres database. Each way has its own pros and cons. For development purposes, I think the quickest and easiest way would be to use Docker and Docker Compose. So that's the way that we are going to do it. We'll also take a quick look at how we can define some simple Spring configuration using the application.properties file. So let's get started. So we are going to use Docker Compose, as I've said, to start a development database. So the first thing that we need to do is to change our directory to where we have the to-do project. So right now I'm at the root directory of that project, and in here I'm going to create a new file that is called dockercompose.yaml. And basically you can open, I use Vim in this case, but you can use any text editor that you want to create that file, or you can use IntelliJ as well. But in here, what we are going to do is we're going to define our service, define our database, and define the username and password and the different volumes, and tell Docker Compose to start it for us. It's actually a lot of typing, so I will save you some time and just paste all of this configuration for you. But we are going to go through it line by line to make everything clear, more or less. So the first line is just necessary to define the version of Docker Compose configuration, and we're going to use, I think this is the latest version, version 3. And in here we define a list of services. And the only service that we are going to use is a database service. So in here we define 4 different fields as well. So the first one is going to be the image. And image is basically the Docker image that we are going to use. And in this case, we're going to use Postgres version 11, Alpine version of that, which is a bit smaller and will start quicker. We also define a number of environment variables, basically define the name of the database, the database user, and the database password. In this case, I will actually change the name of the database to something different. So skeleton is going to be the name of the database that we're going to use in the group project using the started template. But in this case, we probably want to call it the to-do database. And for simplicity, we're just going to call it to-do user and to-do password for the password. And this is absolutely not a production ready database, so don't use it on real users, only on your computer. You should use more secure authentication methods if you're going to use a real database. And in this case, we are just keeping it simple. And in the port section, we're just gonna map the port 5433 on our host network to the port 5432, which is the default Postgres port. Just in case someone has already installed Postgres, we don't want to have a port conflict. For now, we can just basically ignore that. We're not going to change anything in here. And we also going to define a volume, which is basically a way in Docker to specify or to map basically file systems from our computer to the Docker container. It's also not very important to understand at this step. You can just skip it. But the important thing is just like these 3 lines where we basically define the name of the database, the name of the user, the name of the password. And we also need to remember the name of the port that we're going to use, which is going to be the first one, the 5433, because we're going to use these informations to configure Spring Boot to connect to our database. So let's save that file. And right now I have a file called Docker Compose in the root directory that will allow me to start a database very, very easily. So the only thing that I will need to do is run Docker Compose up. And if you don't have Docker Compose installed, make sure to install it. Just Googling how to install Docker and Docker Compose followed by your favorite operating system is going to give you up-to-date information on how to do it. But given that you have it installed, you just run docker-compose and then up. And it might take a bit longer if you are starting it for the first time because it will download it. But I have it already installed, but it shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. As you can see, everything seems to be okay. And I have a Postgres database that is ready to accept connections. So that's perfect. I'm not gonna close this terminal window because if I do that, I will basically kill the database. So I will keep that terminal open. And what I will do is that I will open a new terminal or a new tab. So right now we've started our database, but we need to tell Spring how to connect to the database. And the way we do that is in the application properties file. So in that case, I'm gonna use IntelliJ for simplicity. I have the project already open. So if you go to source main resources, you're gonna see a file called application properties. And basically in here, we're gonna define the username and the password and the port and which database we are going to use. Again, it's a lot of boilerplate code, so I will save you some time and basically paste it in here, and we can go through it line by line and change it to our use case. So basically, we're defining which database we're going to use. We're going to use Postgres SQL, which data source, which is Postgres. We're going to define the URL to our database, and here we're going to need to change some things. So we are indeed using a Postgres SQL database, so we don't need to change that. It's running on our local machine, so it's going to be running on, it is running on localhost. It's running on port 5433, and that's also correct. If we go back to our terminal and take a look at the Docker Compose file, you can see that it is indeed running on port 5433, which is the first port under the ports section. So that's correct, that seems to be matching. But what we'll need to change is basically change the name of the database, the name of the user, and the password. So what we are going to do is go in here, instead of skeleton, we are going to use to-do, which is the name of the database. And then instead of skeleton user, we're gonna use to-do user, which is the name of that user. And in here, we're gonna change the password as well, which is going to be to-do password. So these are the only things that we are going to change. If you are curious about the meaning of these extra lines that we've added in here as well, I can take a quick walkthrough through them. So basically, show SQL is going to show us the SQL queries that are going to be executed in the terminal when we start the application. So it's a good way to see what SQL statements are running to be able to debug problems. Generate DDL and generate DDL auto will make sure to auto create tables for us. It's just the convenient things. When we start working with the Hibernate, it will auto create the tables so that we don't have to worry about that. And it will clear the database when we start the new application so that we don't have to worry about that either. So that's basically the most important properties that we are going to be working with. So actually that's it. We don't have to do anything else. Right now, if we try to start the application, hopefully we will not see any problems with the database. So let's try to start it. And as we can see, it seems to be starting. And if you remember, the last time we were having an error when it comes to connecting to the database, but in that case, it seems to be working. And you can see in here that it's basically using Hibernate.dialect PostgreSQL, and the entity manager factory is working, and basically everything seems to be working. Let's actually try to kill the database and start the application again. So right now the database is running in this tab after running Docker Compose up. So we will quit that operation and then try to basically run the application again. So as you can see, in that case, we just got a problem when it's trying to connect to the database. It said like the host name and port are not correct because it's not being able to connect to the database because our database is dead. So the next time, all what we will have to do is just Docker Compose up to start the database, wait for a couple of seconds, and then the database will be ready to accept connections. And if the database is ready to accept connections, all what we need to do is start our application and it will connect. So that was it for this tutorial.